The future of digital India is poised for remarkable advancements, leveraging emerging technologies to further drive innovation and growth. The ongoing commitment to digital transformation will continue to enhance service delivery, promote inclusive growth, and strengthen India's position as a global leader in the digital economy. With sustained efforts and strategic initiatives, Digital India is set to redefine the socio-economic landscape of the nation, fostering a brighter, more connected future for all citizens. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Analytics Insight podcast, where we talk about the ever evolving tech space. And I'm your host, Priya Dialani. As India accelerates its AI adoption and digital transformation, conversations around data sovereignty, AI infrastructure readiness, and cybersecurity resilience are becoming increasingly critical. The focus is now shifting toward how enterprises and public institutions build secure and compliant digital ecosystem. Let's welcome Dr. Keyur Jathal, Executive Director of Ishan Technologies, to discuss the evolving infrastructure layer behind India's AI economy. Hi, Keyur. How are you doing? Welcome to our podcast.
Thanks, Priya. I'm doing fine. I hope you are having a great time as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Keyur. And of course, I think a conversation today would probably give us more insights about the deeper infrastructure and the backend workflows that actually, form the backbone of today's India's AI economy. And we are going to discuss about it much more in detail. So, let's get started and let's start by, letting me as well as my listeners understand about Ishan Technologies, its specialization. And alongside that, we would also like to know more about you, Keyur. So, how has the journey been till date? And, what exactly is your role at Ishan today?
Perfect. So, to start with, at Ishan Technologies, what we engage in is that we create digital infrastructure platforms, which are the backbone of our customers' AI adoption journey. So, while we do that, the portfolio comprises three major aspects. One is we are a pan India internet connectivity player. Second is we are into data center and co-location. And third, which is the most important priority right now on which we are working, is building Saksham. Saksham is a brand of service that we have, which focuses on sovereign cloud and AI ready infrastructure, which is aligned with India's growing need for data localization as well as regulatory compliance, and it enables secure digital ecosystems. So that's where we are. Where we specialize is that we try to reduce the touch points which the CIO office has today, because over the last 25 years that we have been in existence, we have seen that the CIO has to deal with a multitude of vendors, multitude of technologies, different SLAs, so on and so forth. And orchestrating that itself is a job. So, because we are present across the technology stacks that I mentioned, our effort is to reduce that complexity to help the CIO deliver better on his KRA KPIs, as well as appeal well and be relevant to the CEO, KPIs as well, the CEO of his KPIs as well. So that's what we do at Ishan. Now, in my role as executive director, I focus on the GTM of the new products that we launch in the market, which would tomorrow become important part of our growth trajectory. GTM is obviously the more customer facing side of my role, which dovetails with marketing. And from an internal orientation perspective, as we grow, internal systems become important. So that's where I contribute in terms of optimizing the internal systems for scale along with efficiency. On the personal front, I'm a keen observer of digital strategies, how they impact business outcomes, and that is where I have earned my PhD. And in the formative years of my professional career, which I spent with IBM, HP, and SAP, I sort of got a first-hand view as to how does the IT infrastructure stack contribute to the performance of mission critical applications such as ERP, CRM, and obviously now the AI workloads. So that's more or less about me.
Thank you so much for that great overview, Keyur, about Ishan Technologies and of course, about your journey and role. And we are really glad to understand more about Ishan and its overall vision and mission, and how your role is tied closely with the overall growth of the company. Now, moving ahead, Keyur, I think as we witness the rise of AI, the need for sovereignty is no longer optional. For organizations deploying larger models with access to sensitive data, it is a requirement. And research has shown concerns around sovereignty, hindering innovation and having knock on consequences for innovation. We
Mhm.
don't see it that way. I believe that sovereignty isn't a trade off for innovation. In fact,
True.
for India to scale securely, I think the two must work in tandem. So, what is driving the growing focus on a sovereign cloud infrastructure in India, and why is this shift happening now?
That's a very topical question, I would say, Priya, because think about this for a moment. During the day, we open our UPI apps frequently. A bit further out, an Indian farmer would check a crop advisory app. The Aadhaar authentications that are required for various workflows that we undergo on a routine basis. The hospital records, for example, that we upload. That data is Indian data, generated by people like us, Indian citizens. And until recently, and while we speak as well, most of this data was residing, or rather is residing, in servers sitting in the US or Singapore, right? So, in common parlance, while we were the world's largest data producer, we have little control over our own raw material, which is data again. Now, that, apart from the legalities, etc., is the major driver behind the sovereign push, right? And to further elaborate on that response, I would say that there are three things. So, what are those three things? One, it is about legal exposure. Two, it is about how do we execute on that legal exposure, on that accountability, on that regulation. And third is an interesting pattern that I'm observing now, which is about data economics. So, how do you monetize data? How do you protect the inherent value of the data that you generate? Now, all these three aspects will get impacted by the sovereign push that is happening currently. So, if I talk about the legal exposure right now, I spoke about our data residing in servers, say, for example, in the US, because that's the simple example that we can take nowadays. Now, there is a US law called the Cloud Act. Now, what does it do? It creates a legal mechanism by which US authorities can compel, I know it's a strong word, but it can compel American cloud providers to produce data regardless of where it is physically residing, right? Now, India currently does not have any bilateral agreement that gives it visibility into these kind of requests. Now, we might say that those kind of situations may not arise, but that architecture of dependency itself is the problem, right? So we are bound by certain global acts where we have little say at present. Secondly, India came out with a relevant law, I would say, which was passed in 2023, but it just came in operation in November 2025, so less than a year back, which is where we talk about accountability, enforcing accountability through the DPDP Act. Now, why do we say that it is increasing accountability? Because in commercial terms, there are penalties which start at 50 crores and which go up to, say, 250 crores or so per data breach. So data fiduciaries like your large platforms, fintechs, now have hard obligations around which certain data categories can reside. So net compliance is no longer an aspiration, but it is more or less the starting point. If you are into BFSI, if you are an aspiring fintech, you do have to be cognizant about DPDP and implications if you are in violation of that act. Now, third, what I spoke about was the data economics. So, to explain this point further, I say that, and this is a point where, people underestimate the gravity of this point, is data ownership is now an economic strategy. So, while the first two points were more on the legal and compliance part, this point that I'm making is more about economic strategy. So, data ownership becoming an economic strategy. Now, AI has just accentuated that move or underlined that statement. Why? Because data was once just a compliance liability. Now it is becoming a training asset. So if India's health data, agriculture data, or financial transaction data is aggregated and processed on Indian sovereign infrastructure, Indian AI companies can build models that are genuinely contextual. Meaning to say that if we have got models on, say, languages, on rural economic patterns, on disease profiles with respect to certain demography, then the Indian populace can actually benefit from that data which is residing in India, which was in the first place generated in India, which would in a way translate to an economic benefit for the vendors, indirect economic benefit for the people who are using those AI apps, etc. So the point that you made, that this is not a trade-off, I do agree with that. And these are the points where sovereignty helps, that all the three aspects contribute to the move that is pushing data sovereignty right now. The large part of your question was that why is it now, the three aspects that I mentioned are converging right now. They are happening simultaneously. If we don't rule out, or rather say, if we rule out the geopolitical tensions which we are seeing in the last 60 to 90 days, even if we rule that out, then regulation is live. Why do I say that? That is in terms of DPDP, I say that regulation is live. The infrastructure is finally at scale. We are talking about India AI mission, which is a great, fillip to the infrastructure build for AI use cases. And lastly, the AI gold rush in terms of models, in terms of apps, has made the cost of not owning your data suddenly very visible. So if I don't own my data, that is a costly affair for me. And at Ishan, we are pretty cognizant about the shift that is happening, and we've been building towards this shift. We launched Saksham, that I mentioned during the introduction, which is a sovereign cloud platform that allows enterprises and government institutions to run critical workloads within India with a strong focus on data residency, compliance, as well as security.
Great, Keyur. I think that was very well put forward. And yes, in terms of data sovereignty, of course, DPDP Act mandated, using our in-house data centers to host data, and even RBI mandated, hosting all financial related data within India itself. And I think India, when we talk about India, I think India ranks 13th globally in the number of data centers it has, but it hosts only 3% of the data. So I think that's a stark, reminder as to, how the importance of data sovereignty is today for India. And like, of course, with that, the growing data explosion, India is the second largest, internet user base, and, the smartphone penetration is also the highest. So all of these together are, kind of emphasizing more on data sovereignty. And I think this is very important today, considering the data boom and the surge of AI workloads as well. And
Correct.
with that, I think India is also leading the world in AI adoption, where 94% of organizations have deployed AI assistants beyond the pilot stage, and 88% are actively piloting or rolling out autonomous agents. Yet, while organizations are investing in AI tools and controls, many cannot confirm these controls are effective. About one fourth are not fully confident their AI security controls would detect a compromised AI, and 63%, believe that the controls in place have already experienced or a suspected AI related incident.
Mhm.
Where do you see the biggest gaps today in India's readiness to support the large scale AI adoption?
Right. That's a pretty valid question, Priya. And the facts that you mentioned, 94% are, have already deployed pilot, 88% are evaluating. Now, that number has come from India being AI ready or striving to be India ready. Now, your question asks about India, so I'll have to generalize, because the specific data points that you mentioned are organization wide, and each and every organization will have a different AI adoption journey. So let me talk from a India aspect, in general. So as your points mentioned, India has made strong progress in digital adoption. right? But when it comes to AI at scale, we are talking about, inference workloads beyond the training, correct? So when it comes to AI at scale, the gaps are still there. They are in terms of two larger pillars. One is infrastructure, the other is data readiness, right? So in terms of infrastructure, many organizations have access to cloud platforms, obviously, because that is the enabler for AI adoption. But the ability, so while they've got access to cloud platforms, the ability to run AI workloads consistently across environments remains unlimited. So let me explain this point. Now, when you work on pilot, it is either at a data center within a control facility or in your own data center, right? Because the hardware footprint is probably lesser, so which is where you can afford to buy, a couple of hardware units, certain GPUs. You can run your pilot workloads, but the moment you go beyond your, training phase to actual rollouts, that is where consistency across environments will come into the picture. And this will impact the customer experience, the user experience, and which will dictate the ROI, correct? So there is fragmentation. There is fragmentation between compute, data, as well as network layers. So in a way, adoption of AI is highlighting these gaps, this fragmentation between compute, data, and network layers, which is making it difficult to move from pilots to production. The aspect that you said, that people don't feel really confident and not very much in control, right? So that is the infra, stack, the gaps there, which is the lack of integration among the infrastructure stacks. In terms of data readiness, the gap is in high performance compute, right? AI workloads require GPU backed infrastructure. That is a no-brainer. All of us know about that. But there are environments which are required, which are designed for large scale data processing, which are still evolving in India, because AI is an area where action precedes clarity, and most of us are learning on the job, correct? Which is where your guardrails come in, which is where the domino effect with respect to implementation of AI will come in, and that is where the maximum learning is happening, right? So while the AI workloads require an ecosystem of supporting GPUs working at a critical performance level, the gaps in terms of, say, redundant cooling, power, GPU level orchestration, or data center networking will make the data readiness a problem. So data flow will become a problem if I translate that into normal parlance. So that is infrastructure-led, data flow issue. The other aspect is that the intelligence lies across silos. So one needs to integrate the database across applications in order to create a meaningful picture. A lot of organizations that we are speaking to right now are at that stage. They are aggregating their data lakes. They are trying to make them AI ready with certain use cases in mind. So this is an area where Ishan wishes to add value, that India-based AI readiness, rather AI-ready infrastructure can play a critical role, because where do you host your data becomes important, because that is what we discussed in the previous question. And if Ishan can, bring answers to those critical questions, then we would have done our bit in the value chain.
Definitely, Keyur. And I think in terms of adopting AI at scale, I think the 2 points that you mentioned are pretty much relevant. And infrastructure, I think, plays a really, really critical role in ensuring that, the workloads that, we are running, the AI workloads that we are running should be consistent and continuous. And that's where infrastructure plays an important role. And wherein I mentioned how data centers are evolving, yet with regards to the infrastructure that we need in terms of such operational continuity is still lacking in India. While government policies and initiatives are definitely in place to boost, the digital public infrastructure and support the ongoing boost of data centers in India, there are still lags or still challenges that we encounter. For example, the kind of energy that data centers consume, the electricity grids that we have do not support the kind of growth we'll expect by 2030. And again, then we have modernization of grids using AI and ML to measure the workloads in real time and adjust, integration of renewable energy sources. So, using battery as storage systems, all of these are evolving. And I think in the long run, we would be able to, probably be a leader in the global digital transformation race.
Sure.
And definitely, when we talk about data centers, I think, we have already evolved in the data center growth. But something that is kind of emerging right now is edge infrastructure, AI, 5G networks, and IoT, are rapidly scaling across industries. And I think the traditional centralized cloud computing alone can't deliver the performance, speed, and responsiveness that is required. So edge computing comes into picture, and it changes by processing data closer to where it's generated, and it reduces delays, it's boosting efficiency and reshaping business and society. So what is driving the growth of edge infrastructure in India, and how does it complement the centralized data centers?
So the shift is use case based, right? Now, let us think about this from a real life AI use case scenario, right? For example, if you talk about shop floors, a factory floor in Pune detecting an equipment fault before it becomes a shutdown, that's a good use case to have, correct? A camera on a Mumbai street flagging a security breach within milliseconds, that again is an important use case. In terms of rural settings, a tractor somewhere in rural Rajasthan making irrigation decisions based on soil sensors without having to wait for a server in Bangalore, where obviously connectivity is a challenge. All these use cases would rely on immediate responses. None of these can afford to wait. Now, that's where the edge revolution is coming in. And it's not a technology trend, it's a use case trend, because all of us are now used to instantaneous responses. Right. And so, which is where I say that it's a technology trend servicing a behavioral trend, which is happening. The behavioral trend is happening at the edge, and which is where edge is becoming really prominent. Now, the way in which I look at it is that it's a physics problem. Why do I say that it's a physics problem? That when your application needs to react in real time, the speed of light through a fiber cable to a distant data center is simply too slow. Latency kills the use case, right? So compute is moving. So when I say compute is moving, it is moving from the core, from the data center to the edges, meaning to say that it is not replacing the center. It is not replacing the traditional data center, but it is working in tandem with the edge. So in other words, it is getting closer to where life actually happens. So the previous three examples that we gave, that rather that I gave, that is where the actual work happens. So the compute is getting closer to the edge in that sense. Now, if I give an analogy which is related to, say, the human biology, then here's how to think about it. Your central data center, the core, is the brain. The edge becomes the nervous system, along with obviously the connectivity paraphernalia. The edge becomes the nervous system. Now, the brain handles the memory, correct? The long term processing, if you like. But you don't want that your hand should wait for an instruction from the brain before it pulls away from a fire, a flame, something like that. So that reflex lives at the edge. Now, with AI coming in, we will have a multitude of those reflexive decisions to make. And without the intelligence, without the resources residing at the edge, and without the connectivity complementing it, these moves may not be possible. So, as AI, use case is one, IoT, video analytics, as well as industrial automation, as they scale up across the country, the edge layer will become really, important, and which is where it will make the entire system a smart system rather than a system which is just catching up to the use cases, you know. So speed at the edge and scale at the center. That's the architecture that India is trying to build.
Great, Cure. And I think I very well liked your point that how you explain that, the central data center is the brain and edge acts as the nervous system. So, I think both are very much needed and both work in tandem to ensure that the how we are experiencing the growth of innovative solutions and the kind of back-end scalable support that we need. I think edge will play a very important role, and it will definitely make the entire system more smart, and that's what we need, that's what we are aiming at in terms of managing the boost of AI workloads in India.
Right.
And I think at some point in the last years, India quietly crossed a threshold. I mean, the same infrastructure that powers payments at a five-star hotel in Mumbai works for a chai vendor in Varanasi as well. So it's seamless, it's instant and free. And no other country has this, but India. With Aadhaar coming into picture, we have DigiLocker, and of course, UPI payments is a widespread and a recognized payment system, which was innovated here in India. So a country that spent decades importing technology infrastructure is kind of now exporting the blueprint. So I think we have come a long way in our journey. So, one last question is, what role can India play in the global digital infrastructure landscape over the next decade?
Right. So, in the times that we live in, the headlines that we read every morning, they're all related to geopolitical disturbances, unfortunately, right? So, the first word that comes to our mind is resilience, right? So, can India play a role in resilience? So, the answer is a resounding yes. So while that is a conservative thinking that yes, should things go wrong, can India provide resiliency? The answer is yes. The second aspect is that whenever we talk about India, the length and breadth of the country, the topology of the country, the diverse demography of the country, the sheer volume at which data is being generated comes to our minds, correct? That I would say as reach. So resiliency and reach, these are the two aspects on which India can play a vital role, in the times to come. Now, if I were to give you a context, let's start with a question which nobody's asking loudly enough. Now, if your data center is in Singapore, it's land constrained as well as it is power stressed. If it is in the Middle East, unfortunately, you're watching the conflict creep closer to your cables. So, in both the scenarios, what's your plan B? Now, it is India because that is the most realistic place that one can be. Why? Not because it's cheap, nor because it's big. I see that India offers features such as it is stable, it is politically neutral, and it is building for the long game, right? So stability, neutrality, and scalability is what India is banking on right now. So if you are somewhere across the globe, if your data is residing in Singapore or Middle East, thinking about India makes a really good business sense right now because of the reasons that I mentioned. Now, I'm sure there are reasons more than what I just clicked upon, but these are the three that come to my mind when you're asking that question. Now, so I'm saying that think of it as a Singapore plus one strategy. Every serious infrastructure operator needs a resilient alternative, and which is where India comes in. Now, why is it a good alternative? It has got land to spare. It has got a huge coastline that is becoming a submarine cable superhighway, if you want to call it. And on the energy front, when you spoke about sustainability, that's a good segue to talk about the small modular reactors where India is taking certain appreciable initiatives, the SMRs. So that is clean base load, co-located power for data center that can afford to go dark, right? So the budgets are committed, the legislations have been passed, and we are also seeing private capital is also moving in. That's the resilience part. Now, on the reach part, everyone is talking about India's data. A billion plus users that you alluded to during the earlier part of our talk. 25 gigabytes per month on mobile alone. So that's the quantum of the kind of data that we are generating. Now, the problem is that this data exists in pockets. It is quite rich, but as I mentioned earlier, it is fragmented. So without consolidating it into an AI ready infrastructure, the world's language models are being trained with that blind spot. Now, what is that blind spot? This, data, this rich data lying in pockets across the country. Right? Imagine 25 gigabytes per user data lying and which is untapped by the global, AI learning models. Now, that is where we call a huge blind spot impacting the AI outcomes. So the India AI mission is trying to fix that, not just for India, but for the accuracy of global AI, if we can say that. So the moment India's data through regulated means is made available to larger training models, that will benefit a lot of us and almost all of us. So that is one area where India can contribute in terms of richer data. It can contribute because of its reach. Now, the moment you stitch both these ideas together, so resilience along with reach and club it with the internet infrastructure, it creates a good picture. Why? Because internet's infrastructure is quietly and unfortunately fracturing along the geopolitical lines. Now, what do I mean by that? US infrastructure today carries the American jurisdiction. Chinese infrastructure has its own lineage or baggage, the way in which you look at it. Even European clouds come with their own, regulatory aspects. Now, which is where the neutrality that I spoke about, particularly, the global south where we reside, Southeast Asia, Africa, if you can include, India is a neutral digital address, for these geographies that we spoke about. So to sum it up, in terms of resiliency, in terms of reach, is where India will play a defining role in the next few years to come.
Definitely, Keyur. And I think India is envisioned to emerge as a global leader under the Viksit Bharat vision. Through these strategic initiatives, Digital India aims to foster, more inclusive growth, enhance innovation, and position itself at the forefront of tech advancements on the world stage. Well, thank you so much, Keyur, for taking out the time and effort to be on our podcast today and helping us understand that for India, the path forward is clear. Platforms that deliver sovereignty by default, innovation by design, and parity across environments. So, this gives organizations the freedom of public cloud, the control of private infrastructure, and the confidence to build what's next. Thank you so much, Keyur, for your insights. It was lovely chatting with you.
Thanks.
Great. So, this is for our listeners. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion around India's growth in becoming a global leader for digital public infrastructure and what are certain strong points that India has and what does the future look like. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes, and you can view all our previous episodes on Spotify and other leading platforms. Thank you so much.